Hi folks, it's Chris Gregory here. I'm broadcasting from the heart of deepest Cornwall in a secret location, and today we're going to talk about one of Bob Dylan's greatest songs, if not Bob Dylan's greatest song, Desolation Row. This is a special video version, so I do hope you enjoy.
Is it rolling, Bob?
Is it rolling, Bob?
Is it rolling, Bob?
So this is part one of Desolation Row, Between the Windows of the Sea. I is another. If the brass wakes the trumpet, it's not its fault. That's obvious to me. I witness the unfolding of my own thought. I watch it, I hear it, I make a stroke with the bow. The symphony begins in the depths or springs with a bound onto the stage. If the old imbeciles hadn't discovered only the false significance of self, we wouldn't have to now sweep away those millions of skeletons which have been piling up the products of their one-eyed intellect since time immemorial and claiming themselves to be their authors. Arthur Rimbaud. Desolation Row is a hard song to sing. It's undoubtedly one of Bob Dylan's most profound, accomplished and ambitious compositions, full of poetic vitality, biting wit, unforgettable character sketches, literary and other allusions, distinctive rhymes and transcendent metaphors. The lyrics operate on many levels, as a commentary on the crazy hypocrisies of the modern world, as a declaration of the existence of the counterculture, and as a literary manifesto. Despite its length, 11 minutes on its initial release, it has a clearly defined dramatic structure, including a clever framing device within which it proceeds to a quite beautifully expressive climax. It's arguably Dylan's most original and complete work, a song which could only have come from the particular historical moment it was written in, and yet which is also completely timeless and full of universal truths. Yet, as the many unsuccessful attempts at recording the song, now available on the bootleg series release The Cutting Edge, demonstrate, Dylan struggled at first to place the tirade of astonishing lyrics in the song in an appropriate musical setting. Although he's performed it many hundreds of times over his subsequent career, he's arguably never discovered an alternative arrangement that matches up to the sheer verbal and emotional power of the final Highway 61 take. In 1965, Dylan was going through the most profound musical change of his career. Having made his name as a solo folk singer with a social conscience, a kind of updated version of his hero Woody Guthrie, he was then engaged in his highly controversial switch to becoming a rock star. While the previous record, Bringing It All Back Home, had begun the process, it was still divided between acoustic and electric sides. Now, Dylan was attempting to cut an entirely electric album, yet somehow Desolation Row does not quite fit the mould. For one thing, it has 10 six-line verses and uses the form of a traditional ballad, with many verses centred on a repeated musical pattern, with no bridge section or real chorus, although each verse ends dramatically with the title phrase. In many ways, it can be seen as a successor to 1963's A Hard Rain's Are Gonna Fall, a song which, perhaps surprisingly, later worked very effectively in a rocked-up form. It's no exaggeration to claim that at this point in his career, Dylan was actually in the process of reinventing the medium of songwriting itself. He'd immersed himself not only in the old ballads and blues, but also in the entire canon of Western literature, from Homer to Shakespeare to the Romantics, the Modernists, and the Beat poets. He was also enthralled to Elvis Presley, Little Richard, Buddy Holly, and, lately, the Beatles. All of these influences now poured into his writing. But what kind of song is Desolation Row? Despite its musical form, with its stream of surreal images and eclectic cultural references, it can hardly be really called a folk ballad. It also has a basic rhythmic core which can set heads nodding and feet tapping. In many ways, it's a rock and roll song. To carry it off as a lyrical and rhythmic tour de force requires a particular effort of will. On the album's bizarre sleeve notes, Dylan states that the record consists of not so much songs, but exercises in tonal breath control. It's almost as if, to perform this epic recitation, he has to take one extremely deep breath. The rest of the performance is a kind of long exhalation, which can only be achieved with intense concentration and focus. The singer needs to have quite extraordinary control of his diction and phrasing in order to make this convincing. Not surprisingly, there have been few successful cover versions of Desolation Row. The key to the success of the recording on Highway 61 Revisited was the addition of second acoustic guitarist Charlie McCoy, who later played with Dylan on Blonde, John Wesley Harding and Nashville Skyline. Various attempts to record the song with electric guitars, drums and even piano proved unsuccessful. Finally, the decision was made to go back to acoustic guitar-led recording. The addition of McCoy's brightly inventive fills, and in particular the little rhythmic flourish that comes at the end of each verse, drive the song along. Russ Savakis' low-key bass playing also helps anchor the sound. The result is a highly spirited performance, transforming a song which could be seen as doomy and depressing into a triumphantly uplifting hymn to the new rising consciousness of the mid-60s. The Highway 61 Revisited album gives voice to the new perspective for which Dylan had become the most articulate avatar. The forceful and imaginative Like a Rolling Stone, which opens the album, celebrates this consciousness through what appears at first to be a personal put-down of a spoiled rich girl, but which turns into a mighty declaration of intellectual and spiritual independence. Tombstone Blues is a merciless satire on American cultural institutions. Ballad of a Thin Man is a devastating attack on a narrow-minded individual who just cannot grasp what this new way of looking at life entails. The title song mocks the way that conventional religion is linked to warmongering. Queen Jane approximately explores issues of sexual identity, while, just like Tom Thumb's Blues, outlines the effects of various mind-expanding drugs through the personas of Mexican prostitutes. Just 3 years earlier, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world had held its breath on the brink of destruction. Meanwhile, Martin Luther King had expressed his dream, Kennedy had been shot, the US Army had been deployed in huge numbers in the unforgiving jungles of Vietnam, and the Beatles had revolutionized American rock music. In the eyes of the burgeoning youth movement, the world was being run by leaders who were literally insane, and every cultural shibboleth could now be challenged. Hard Rain had been a direct, if highly poetic, evocation of defiance of this madness in the face of an apocalypse. But now the discourse had shifted. It was now necessary to examine not just the mentality of war, but the sickness of human culture and institutions that had brought the world to the precipice. A straightforward statement like Barry Maguire's inane hit Eve of Destruction, or even Dylan's polemical With God on Our Side, would no longer cut the mustard. Desolation Row has frequently been compared to T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which examined the shifting of consciousness that occurred after the horrors of the First World War. Dylan even name-checks Eliot in the song, but perhaps a more appropriate comparison is with Allen Ginsberg's Howl, the visionary beat poet's brilliantly extended, Whitman-esque rant against the shallowness of American post-war culture. Howl famously begins, "I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness," which, in the light of the anti-establishment explosion of the 1960s, turned out to be extremely prophetic, as figures like Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Brian Wilson, Brian Jones, Syd Barrett and Peter Green experienced psychological burnout or early tragic deaths. The songs on the Highway 61 album are each placed in dreamlike or perhaps nightmarish scenarios in which a whole range of fantastical characters, from Miss Lonely to Napoleon in Rags to Mr. Jones to Sweet Melinda, the goddess of gloom, appear and disappear rapidly. Some of these, like Ma Rainey, Beethoven, the King of the Philistines or Paul Revere, are genuine historical figures. Others, like the Commander-in-Chief, Queen Jane, or the Sword Swallower, seem to be satirical representations of real people. This cinematic technique of allowing characters to appear and then rapidly cutting away from them reaches its apotheosis in Desolation Row, which presents a long cavalcade of real historical figures and famous literary archetypes. Dylan places these characters, many of which are clearly symbolic, in bizarre or unfamiliar contexts. Despite their brief cameos, each one appears to take on a life of its own. They could be called living symbols. Huge numbers of words have been written in the very many analyses of the song that have appeared, in which commentators have attempted to identify each character's symbolic meaning as if the song is some kind of puzzle that the listener is supposed to decode. But Dylan's characters take on a life of their own. Their interactions can, and of course have been, interpreted in many different ways. They are set up to be delightfully ambiguous. Dylan mixes a scathing critique of contemporary morals and beliefs with a tone of dark and ironic humour. When the song was first performed in 1965 to audiences who had never heard it before, as the album had yet to be released, they reacted by laughing as the witty lines and cutting rhymes poured out. Another misunderstanding of Desolation Row, which many commentators, attempting to place it in its literary context or to justify it as a serious work, have perpetrated, is that it is a modernist text. But although, like Beckett's seminal modernist text Waiting for Godot, it delights in comic absurdity and ambiguity, and like The Wasteland, it is crammed with allusions, it steadfastly refuses to resign itself to the ultimate sense of hopelessness that such modernist texts convey. Dylan's references to the modernists themselves, who actually appear as characters in the song, are decidedly mocking. Although to some extent he embraces modernism's complex worldview and uses some of its literary tropes and techniques, whereas modernist texts like Joyce's Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake are deliberately constructed to be difficult, Desolation Row ultimately conveys a message of hope and positivity. Ultimately, the song conveys what could be called a romanticist message, in that it focuses on the power of the imagination and uses certain Gothic tropes. Just as Dylan, as he is pushing songwriting to his limits here, he is also simultaneously redefining modern poetry. He uses music, rhyme and rhythm to return poetic expression to its status as a popular art form. In doing so, he creates a template which so many singer-poets, from Joni Mitchell to Leonard Cohen to Paul Simon to Richard Thompson, would follow. As Ginsberg, by now not only a friend of Dylan but a devoted admirer, recognised, this concept of the role of poetry had been one which he and the other beat poets had conceptualised in the 1950s. But their impassioned poetry readings to jazz backings had never reached the mass popularity of Dylan and his successors. In Desolation Row, Dylan's use of dream narratives and fantastical scenarios also recalls the work of Blake, Shelley, Keats and the other Romantic poets. He takes complex, elusive and razor-sharp poetry into the homes of millions, creating art as resonant, universal and timeless as that of Shakespeare, to whom he quite naturally alludes in the song. The first and final verses of Desolation Row form a kind of frame for its fantastical narratives, through which the action in the verse is filtered. The events of the song appear to take place within one evening as night closes in. We begin with some of Dylan's most evocative and mysterious opening lines. They're selling postcards of the hanging, they're painting the passports brown. The alliterative P's here already have the effect of pushing the narrative forward positively and engaging the listener. The next lines, the beauty parlour is filled with sailors. The circus is in town, are similarly beguiling, with the P's now sliding into more reassuring S sounds. Already, Dylan has built up a remarkable series of resonant visual images. The opening lines suggest a world in which rampant commercialism and crass bureaucracy has run riot. The first line has been linked to a real-life event, a horrific lynching of two black men in Duluth, Dylan's birthplace, in the 1920s. This may well be where Dylan got the inspiration for the line from. Postcards produced to celebrate the event were actually sold at the time, but Dylan may also be referring to the way that violence is routinely commodified and arguably celebrated throughout the mass media. In just 6 words, he paints a picture of a very sick world. The next line already takes us into more surreal territory, as the authorities apparently try to wipe out the proof of identity of those who are marginalised in modern society. The succeeding lines paint a graphic picture of a world which is characterised as a kind of mad circus, in which normal reality is reversed. They counteract the repressive nature of the opening lines, taking us into the song's vivid dream world. Dylan is very fond of using circuses as metaphors. He also seems to like the sound of the word circus itself. In Mr. Tambourine Man, his protagonist is circled by the circus sands. Ballad of a Thin Man includes a parade of circus freaks and performers. It may be that all the events and characters in the song are actually part of a circus. This, it seems, is how Dylan views the modern world, as a fantastical show full of performers desperately trying to impress us. Then we're introduced to the first character. The narrative tone shifts to that of a circus barker who declares, "Here comes the blind commissioner." This figure appears to be some kind of generic authority figure, but he is also a circus performer. We are told that he is in some kind of trance and that one hand is tied to the tightrope walker. It seems that he has been made to walk the tightrope, obviously a very perilous task for a blind person to be asked to do. But, in case we have any sympathy for him, Dylan undercuts it with vicious humour. The other is in his pants, which may be a sexual reference, but could also imply that this official is trousering any profits from the circus. So he may be a symbol of blind, directionless but corrupt authority, or he may just be playing with himself. The concluding lines, "And the riot squad, they're restless, they need somewhere to go, as Lady and I look out tonight from Desolation Row," continue the T alliteration from the line about the tightrope walker. The notion of a restless riot squad now pushes the narrative into a more socio-political direction, the inference being that the squad is basically a bunch of thugs spoiling for a fight. In the context of the 1960s civil rights movement and the viciously racist policing that protesters were often met with, this seems particularly apposite. So far we've been given a picture of a topsy-turvy, corrupt world, elements of which are nevertheless presented as popular entertainment to the brainwashed population. It's important to note, however, that the world is being described is not Desolation Row itself. Here we see the narrator and his lady looking at this mad world from that place. This will be consistent throughout the song. Desolation Row is in fact a place of refuge, the only place where sanity and true humanity can be found. This may seem somewhat contradictory, but the world being described here, whatever its drawbacks, is hardly desolate. The term desolation can be strongly identified with the notion of being beat, which Kerouac, Ginsberg and others advanced as a measure of the degradation and madness they felt they had to put themselves through to truly break away from the mindset of conventional society. Kerouac's stream of consciousness novel Desolation Angels had recently been published, and Dylan, ever the magpie, lifts several lines from it in this song. Desolation Row is, of course, a state of mind rather than a physical location. It represents a place which is not necessarily easy to get to. To reach it, one must perhaps be ready to subject oneself to a desolate existence, perhaps by pushing oneself to mental extremes. But it appears to be the only place from which one can really appreciate just how twisted and crazy the real world has become. The next 8 verses introduce us to a cavalcade of characters who may or may not double as circus performers. Dylan sums up each of their qualities succinctly with mordant wit. We begin in the world of fairy tales with Cinderella, in a story which advances the idea that true human worth, in the form of the honest but put upon servant girl, must triumph over wealth and narcissism, as epitomised by the heroine's ugly sisters. But the character we meet here certainly does not seem to be waiting for Prince Charming or expecting any magical transformations. We're told that she seems so easy, and that in a delicately, if rather suggestively executed turn of phrase, "It takes one to know one," she smiles. Then, in a quite brilliant visual transformation, we hear that, "and she puts her hands in her back pocket, Betty Davis style." This is a modern, liberated Cinderella, presumably dressed in jeans. She seems so easy may suggest a woman who is particularly sexually active. The actress Betty Davis, who specialised in powerful female roles in which she displayed an independent sexuality, really did have a habit of putting her hands in her back pockets. Suddenly Romeo, who seems to be a rather pathetic figure, appears, apparently in pursuit of Cinderella. In comes Romeo, who's moaning, "You belong to me, I believe." This may be a reference to "You Belong to Me," a moving, if lachrymose ballad, first recorded by Joe Stafford in 1952 and later by Dean Martin, Patsy Cline and many others. Dylan himself recorded a version for the soundtrack of Natural Born Killers in 1992. But, as is pointed out to the anguished lover, he is in the wrong place. Naturally, he should be pursuing Juliet, not Cinderella. The verse ends ominously. The only sound that's left after the ambulances go is Cinderella sweeping up on Desolation Row. We may speculate that Romeo, who of course kills himself in Shakespeare's play, spoiler alert, a bit late, wasn't it, has committed suicide. Or perhaps he's been removed to an asylum. In any case, Cinderella carries on regardless. She's protected from the vagaries of this shifting dream world because she lives on Desolation Row. But the clearly confused lover Romeo appears to have wandered into the wrong narrative entirely, again indicating that these characters exist in a world where everything is slightly askew. We now see that the sun has gone down and that the evening's revelries are about to begin, but something in the universe is out of joint. We hear that the moon is almost hidden, the stars are beginning to hide, as if these natural features are somehow alive but are hiding themselves away, as if in shame. The fortune-telling lady has taken all her things inside, suggests that any conventional prediction of the future is unlikely to be accurate, as an apocalyptic event is about to occur. The following, all except for Cain and Abel and the Hunchback of Notre Dame, everybody's making love or else expecting rain, is tantalizingly ambiguous. It seems that the population of the world of the song are either frantically taking their last chances to make love before the end comes, or just sitting around hopelessly, waiting for it to happen. More strange juxtapositions of character from different origins then occur. The biblical Cain and Abel are lumped together with Victor Hugo's eponymous bell ringer. In Genesis, Cain and Abel are the sons of Adam and Eve, and Cain becomes the first murderer when he kills his brother before being exiled to walk the earth to atone for this perhaps unforgivable sin. Quasimodo, the hunchback, is another tragic figure who is powerless to save Esmeralda, the girl he's besotted with, from the gallows. In his rage, he throws the Archdeacon Frollo, who is also in love with the girl, from the tower of the cathedral to his death. The implication here appears to be that these characters are somehow detached from the world of the song, being so bound up in their tragic lives that they will not be able to participate in the coming festivities. The final lines of the verse, however, introduce another figure, the Good Samaritan, who, in the New Testament, saves a dying man without prejudice when others pass him by, who is happily preparing himself now for tonight's carnival on Desolation Row, an event to which Cinderella and Romeo have not been invited. But our grown-up Cinderella, however, does not seem bothered that she will not be going to the ball.
Is it rolling, Bob?
Is it rolling, Bob?
Is it rolling, Bob?